Mason Reed's worn coat made the interview room burst into laughter. The poor single father had asked only for a warehouse supervisor position, yet the head of human resources openly sneered at his scuffed shoes and his thin 4-year gap of a resume. Charlotte Hayes, the young chief executive, watched in silence, unaware that Mason was quietly testing every person inside a company he secretly controlled. Just as they moved to escort him from the building, the boardroom doors swung open. Every director rose at once, bowing their heads, and a single voice broke the silence. "Welcome back, Mr. Chairman. Stay until the end to see whether Mason chooses revenge, forgiveness, or a real chance for those who deserve it." On a cold winter morning in Chicago, Mason Reed parked his old pickup truck 2 blocks from the headquarters of Hayes Reed Industries. He did not pull into the executive lot, even though the highest-level access card in the company still sat quietly in his wallet. Mason wore a faded coat, a plain button-down shirt, and leather shoes that had been polished carefully despite the wear along the toes. He had deliberately left behind the expensive watch he once wore, avoided calling for a company car, and had not contacted the board secretary in months. Before stepping out of the truck, Mason took a short call from the babysitter. Grace had arrived safely at school. She asked whether her father would get the new job. Mason only told her that today he would find out whether the company still deserved the name printed across its own building. He offered no further explanation about his daughter, keeping her far from anything that might unfold that day. The call revealed only what mattered. Mason was a devoted father who had grown used to a life lived far from any spotlight. 4 years earlier, after his wife Hannah had passed away, Mason had withdrawn from every operational role at the company he helped build. His shares were managed through a family trust, and the board understood he still held the title of chairman, though none of them knew when or if he intended to return. Over the past 6 months, Mason had quietly received dozens of anonymous letters from warehouse employees. They described older workers being pushed out, honest applicants turned away for reasons that had nothing to do with skill, safety equipment being cut to save money, and a culture where speaking up carried real risk. Rather than announce an inspection that would only give people time to hide what they had done, Mason submitted an application under his own name. He wanted to know whether the people currently running his company would still recognize the founder who had disappeared from public life, or whether they would judge him only by what stood in front. The wind off the lake cut through the narrow streets, and Mason pulled his collar higher as he passed a line of delivery trucks idling outside a loading dock he had once helped design with his own hands. Back then, the company had been small enough that he knew every driver by name. As Mason walked toward the building bearing the name Hayes Reed Industries, he glanced up at his own name stretched across the glass, then kept walking without breaking stride. He thought briefly of Hannah, of the quiet mornings before either of them had said a word, and of how empty the apartment still felt without her. Grace was the reason he still got up before dawn, and she was the reason he had finally decided to come back. The security guard at the entrance saw nothing more than an applicant in an old coat. He had no idea that the man passing through his line held a key capable of closing the entire company, or opening it wide enough for the truth to finally get in. On the 32nd floor, Charlotte Hayes was chairing an executive meeting. She presented a plan to open 3 new distribution centers, but the staffing numbers on the screen kept contradicting each other every time someone asked a direct question. Turnover had climbed sharply. Workplace injuries had nearly doubled over the past year. Logan Pierce, the chief operating officer, explained it away as a natural side effect of what he called operational optimization, a phrase he used often and defined rarely. Charlotte did not fully trust Logan, though she had no clear proof of anything beyond instinct. The reports prepared by Jessica Miller were always clean, almost too clean, the kind of numbers that left no room for the kind of questions Charlotte wanted to ask. Every chart looked polished, every summary tied neatly into the next, and yet something about the smoothness of it all made her uneasy in a way she could not fully explain to the rest of the room. Charlotte had become chief executive after her father, Elijah Hayes, passed away. Elijah and Mason had built the company together from a single small warehouse. Elijah managed the finances and the client relationships, while Mason designed the logistics systems that eventually became the backbone of the entire company's value. After Elijah's death, and Mason's sudden withdrawal from public life, Charlotte inherited an organization far larger than anything she had direct experience running. She had studied finance, not logistics, and the warehouse floor had always felt like a language spoken by other people. Logan used the resulting gap to quietly consolidate control over daily operations, positioning himself as the only person who truly understood how the machine worked, and Charlotte, still grieving and still new to the role, had let him. During the meeting, Logan proposed eliminating 300 older employees and replacing them with lower-cost contract labor. Charlotte pushed back, insisting on a full safety review before any such decision moved forward. Logan smiled thinly, suggesting that Charlotte was letting emotion interfere with sound business judgment. The exchange revealed something Charlotte had suspected for months. Logan did not respect her authority, he merely performed deference when it suited him. Just after the meeting ended, Jessica reported that an unusual applicant named Mason Reed had applied for a warehouse supervisor position. Logan paused for a moment, recalling the founder's name from old company lore, though nothing about the current photo on file matched the image in his memory. Jessica noted the 4-year gap in the resume, the absence of recent credentials, and an address in an ordinary residential neighborhood. She wanted to reject the application before it ever reached an interview room. Charlotte stared at the name Mason Reed longer than she meant to. It reminded her of old photographs still kept in her father's former office, though the man in those pictures had been younger, worn glasses, and always stood a step behind the crowd rather than in front of it. Unsure why the name unsettled her, Charlotte asked for Mason to be granted an interview after all. She decided to attend in person, wanting to see firsthand the hiring process Logan always insisted was completely fair. Logan raised no objection. Instead, he turned to Jessica with a faint, dismissive smile. "Bring him in," he said. "Sometimes a weak candidate is useful. It reminds everyone the system is still working exactly the way it should." Charlotte heard the remark clearly, and for the first time she found herself asking a question she had never allowed herself to consider before. Working for whom, exactly? Mason arrived at the reception desk 15 minutes early. The receptionist glanced at his coat and directed him to a small row of chairs near the delivery entrance, while candidates in tailored suits were shown into the main waiting area near the executive corridor. The chairs by the delivery entrance smelled faintly of cardboard and cold air from the loading dock, and the fluorescent light overhead flickered every few seconds, as though the building itself had already decided which visitors deserved comfort and which did not. Mason said nothing. He simply took note of names, tones of voice, and the small details most people never bothered to notice. An older cleaning woman dropped a box of supplies nearby. Several people stepped around it without pausing. Mason knelt down and helped her gather everything. When she thanked him, he asked how long she had worked at the company. "Nearly 12 years, she said, though she suspected she might soon lose her position once the company finished outsourcing custodial work to a new contractor. She had no idea the man listening to her had once written the very clause meant to protect long-serving employees like her. Another applicant named Owen was crossed off the list by Jessica for arriving 3 minutes late, even after he explained that a train had stalled due to a mechanical failure. Jessica told him plainly that the company did not hire people who could not manage their own lives. Mason watched all of it without a word. Charlotte appeared in the hallway and noticed the divide between the two waiting areas. When she asked why, Jessica explained that the main area was reserved for management candidates, while the smaller area was meant for operational staff. Mason immediately recognized the explanation as false. The position he had applied for was itself a supervisory role, identical in level to several candidates seated comfortably across the hall. As Charlotte passed by, Mason stepped aside politely to let her through. She noticed his calm eyes, steady in a way rarely seen in someone supposedly desperate for work. There was no anxious fidgeting, no nervous glance toward the clock. He studied the building the way an architect inspects a structure he once designed, not the way a stranger waits for judgment. His gaze drifted briefly to a water stain on the ceiling tile near the elevator bank, a small imperfection he recognized from a maintenance report he had read months earlier and never followed up on himself. Charlotte asked whether they had met before. Mason answered simply that perhaps she had seen him once, in a room where everyone only looked toward the person standing at the front. The answer left Charlotte quietly unsettled. Logan appeared moments later, looking Mason up and down before announcing loudly that the company was hiring a supervisor, not handing out charity. A few managers standing nearby laughed along with him. Mason did not react. He simply glanced at the name badge on Logan's jacket, then asked whether he always judged every candidate that quickly. Logan answered that it took him less than 10 seconds to know when someone did not belong in a place like this. Mason nodded slightly. "Good," he said, "because it took me about the same amount of time to understand exactly how you are running this place." Charlotte heard every word clearly. Logan assumed the remark was simple insolence, but Charlotte noticed something else entirely. The man in the worn coat had not flinched, not even for a moment. The interview room held Mason, Charlotte, Logan, Jessica, and two operations managers seated along the far wall. Jessica began by questioning the 4-year gap in his resume. Mason explained that he had stepped away from work to care for his family after his wife passed away. Jessica showed no sign of sympathy. She remarked that people who left the workforce for that long usually struggled to adapt to a modern environment. Logan asked whether Mason would be willing to work weekends, night shifts, and unpaid overtime to, in his words, prove his loyalty from the very first week. Mason calmly asked whether that expectation matched the company's actual labor policy. Logan laughed, suggesting that a man in his position should not be questioning the terms of an offer he had not even received yet. Jessica glanced at his worn shoes and asked whether he could even afford proper attire if he were hired. One of the managers chuckled quietly. Charlotte did not laugh, though she still held back from stepping in. She wanted to see exactly how far the room would go, and she felt a growing discomfort at realizing this culture had existed under her leadership without her ever confronting it directly. Mason was handed a hypothetical scenario. A distribution center was behind schedule, and a worker had reported cracks forming along a storage rack. Stopping operations would cost the company millions in delayed shipments. What would he do? Mason answered without hesitation. Evacuate the area, lock down the rack system immediately, and inspect the structure before allowing anyone back inside. Logan said the answer proved Mason did not understand real business decisions. He wanted the shift to continue running until its scheduled end, with inspection only afterward. Mason asked him directly what he would tell a grieving family if that rack collapsed and someone died chasing that same schedule. The room fell silent. Logan, visibly irritated, pushed forward a printed operations diagram and asked Mason to identify the cause of a simulated bottleneck. Mason studied it for only a few seconds before locating the flaw in the distribution flow. He then pointed out something else entirely. The diagram was built on an older algorithm he himself had originally designed, one that had since been quietly altered to favor speed over safe load limits. Logan accused him of guessing. Jessica added that a man with such a thin resume could not possibly understand a system this complex. Mason wrote a short equation on the whiteboard and explained that if the system continued running as currently configured, the Southern Chicago Distribution Center could face a cascading structural failure within a matter of weeks. Charlotte's attention sharpened immediately. That morning's internal report had mentioned unusual vibration readings at that very facility, a detail she had noted but not yet acted upon. Logan quickly erased the board and announced the interview was over. Jessica slid Mason's file back across the table. "Mr. Reed," she said, "this company needs people of real value, not an unemployed father who shows up with a sad story." Mason looked directly at her. "I did not come here for sympathy," he said. "I came here to see whether this company still has any dignity left." After Mason's answer, Charlotte asked for 10 more minutes to continue the interview. Logan objected, but she reminded him that the final decision belonged to the chief executive, not the chief operating officer. Charlotte asked where Mason had learned so much about distribution systems. Mason replied that he had once worked inside a small warehouse, long before technology became something companies used to hide decisions nobody wanted to take responsibility for. The remark echoed something her father used to say. "Machines should serve people," Elijah always told her, not the other way around. Charlotte had heard the phrase so many times as a child that it had become background noise, a slogan printed on old company mugs, rather than a principle anyone still practiced, and hearing it spoken again by a stranger in a worn coat made it suddenly feel real again. Charlotte asked what Mason believed was truly wrong with the company. Rather than offer vague accusations, Mason named 3 specific problems. Hiring practices were quietly filtering out workers based on appearance and personal circumstance. Safety data had been separated from production numbers to hide the connection between speed targets and rising injuries. And operational authority had become concentrated in the hands of one person who never faced any direct consequence for the outcomes. Logan demanded proof. Mason produced a copy of a letter written by a warehouse worker named John, who had reported a cracked storage rack months earlier and was demoted shortly afterward for raising the issue. Logan claimed anyone could forge a letter like that. Mason then asked Charlotte a direct question. Why had complaint file number HR 4172 never appeared in any report sent to her office? Charlotte turned to Jessica. Jessica's expression drained of color, because that complaint number was real, and only someone with internal access could possibly know it. Mason explained calmly that he had seen the number on a forgotten folder left on a cart in the hallway. In truth, he had already known the number before that morning, but he chose not to reveal his real source just yet. Charlotte began to understand that Mason was not an ordinary candidate. She studied his face more closely, remembering an old photograph of her father standing beside a younger man at the opening of their very first warehouse. Yet the Mason in front of her now looked older, his hair touched with gray, no longer wearing the glasses from that photograph. She was not ready to trust her own memory just yet. Logan signaled for security, insisting that Mason had stolen confidential company material. Charlotte stopped him, demanding to see Mason's original application file instead. Jessica claimed the system had somehow deleted certain records without explanation. Mason asked gently whether a system could truly delete files by accident, or whether it was simply easier to blame the system than the people who ran it. Charlotte asked Logan to leave the room so she could speak with Mason privately. Logan refused outright, folding his arms and insisting that as chief operating officer he had every right to remain present for any decision touching his own department. Beneath the table, without anyone noticing, he sent a quiet message to security, instructing them to remove Mason from the building before Charlotte could finish her sentence. Before security arrived, an internal alarm sounded throughout the building. The Southern Chicago Distribution Center had just reported instability in its automated storage rack system. Exactly as Mason predicted, the load sensors were registering a severe shift along the support axis. Several workers were still inside the affected zone. Logan ordered the operations team to keep running for another 10 minutes so a large shipment could be completed on schedule. Charlotte immediately objected. Mason stood up and asked Charlotte to order an immediate shutdown. Logan mocked him, asking what authority an unemployed applicant thought he had to give any order at all. Mason turned toward Charlotte instead. "You do not need to trust me," he said. "Just look at the vibration readings on column 3. If the margin passes another 2%, the entire rack level could slip off its housing." Charlotte checked the monitor. The numbers matched exactly what Mason had described. She ordered an evacuation despite Logan's continued objections. Minutes later, a section of racking buckled and collapsed into the very zone that had just been cleared. No one was injured. The event confirmed everything Mason had warned about and revealed that Logan had been fully prepared to risk human lives to protect a production quota. Mason showed no satisfaction in being right. He simply asked Charlotte whether the company had a direct reporting line workers could use to flag danger without going through their immediate supervisors. Charlotte admitted that such a system existed on paper, but every report was still routed through Jessica's department before reaching anyone above her. Mason pointed out that this was precisely how Logan had managed to control the flow of information for so long. Security arrived, following Logan's earlier instructions. Jessica demanded that Mason be escorted out immediately for accessing confidential company data. Charlotte overruled the order, but Logan insisted that Mason represented a genuine security threat and accused Charlotte of losing her judgment under pressure. For the first time, Charlotte openly confronted him in front of the room. She instructed the legal department to freeze all operational data and personnel files without delay. Logan understood that if the data were examined closely, the hidden contracts routed through his brother-in-law's company would be exposed. He decided Mason needed to be removed from the building before the board could arrive. Mason received a short message from Samuel Carter. The full board had already gathered on the 33rd floor. Mason glanced at the clock on the wall. The test in every sense had come to its end. He asked Charlotte one final question. "If today I truly were nothing more than a poor man looking for work," he said, "would you still believe I deserve to be treated like a human being?" Charlotte was quiet for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said, "and I am sorry it took me this long to say something." It was the answer Mason had come there hoping to hear. He rose from his chair and adjusted the collar of his coat. "Then perhaps," he said, "there is still something in this place worth saving." At that exact moment, the door to the interview room opened. Samuel Carter walked in with the full board of directors, the chief legal counsel, and the head of independent audit close behind him. Logan immediately shifted his tone, trying to explain that they were simply dealing with a disruptive applicant. Samuel did not look at Logan at all. He walked straight to Mason, stood at attention, and spoke clearly. "Welcome back, Mr. Chairman." Every member of the board rose at once to acknowledge him. Jessica went pale. One of the managers dropped his pen. Logan turned toward Charlotte, hoping she might deny what he had just heard, but she only stared at Mason with quiet astonishment. Samuel announced that Mason Reed was the company's co-founder, holder of 51% of voting control through the Reed Family Trust, and the lawful chairman of the board. Mason had not bought his way back into the company at the last moment. He had controlled it from the very beginning, choosing only to step back from active leadership after the loss of his family. Mason explained that 6 months earlier, the audit committee had received allegations of concealed accidents and contract fraud. Since every prior official review had somehow been anticipated and managed by Logan in advance, Mason had chosen to return himself, disguised as an ordinary applicant. He had deliberately chosen a low-level operational role because he wanted to understand exactly how someone without power would be treated inside his own company. Mason played back a legally recorded copy of the interview, along with security footage from the waiting area. Every dismissive remark from Jessica and Logan had already been captured on record. Logan immediately claimed the entire exchange had simply been a pressure test designed for management track candidates. Mason asked why applicants in tailored suits had never been subjected to anything resembling that same treatment. Logan had no answer. Samuel presented further evidence detailing contracts quietly redirected to a shipping company owned by Logan's brother-in-law. Jessica had altered hiring records, deleted formal complaints, and privately flagged disadvantaged applicants as what her own notes called cultural risk. Logan turned on Charlotte, insisting that as chief executive, ultimate responsibility rested with her alone. Charlotte did not try to hide from it. She admitted she had relied too heavily on reports, had failed to verify conditions in person, and had stayed silent for far too long during the interview itself. Her willingness to accept responsibility stood in stark contrast to Logan's attempts to shift blame onto everyone around him. Mason suspended both Logan and Jessica effective immediately, instructing them to surrender their company credentials. He made no attempt to humiliate either of them publicly. "Authority does not give me the right to treat you the way you treated others," he said. "It only gives me the responsibility to stop you from continuing." As Logan was escorted from the room, he turned back and asked Mason why a man of such wealth would dress like someone with nothing. Mason answered without hesitation. "I am not pretending to be poor," he said. "I simply removed everything that made you think I deserved respect in the first place." After the meeting, Charlotte invited Mason into her father's old office. The room still held a framed photograph from the day Elijah and Mason opened their very first warehouse together. Charlotte finally recognized the man in the photograph as Mason himself. She apologized for not seeing it sooner, but Mason told her that for the past 4 years he had worked hard to make sure no one would. He spoke briefly about Hannah. During her illness, Mason had been constantly pulled away by the demands of a rapidly growing company. He once believed that building something larger would protect his family, until he finally understood that no amount of success could buy back the days he had already lost. After Hannah passed away, Mason stepped back from the company entirely to raise Grace on his own, handing operational control to the board. He continued reviewing reports quietly from a distance, but never intervened directly, not until the letters started arriving. Charlotte asked why he had not simply reached out to her privately the moment he suspected something was wrong. Mason answered that he first needed to know whether she was part of the sickness inside the company, or whether she still had it in her to become part of the cure. The words stung, but Charlotte admitted it was a fair question to ask. She confessed that she had spent years living in the shadow of 2 founders whose names still hung over every decision she made. To prove she was tough enough for the role, she had leaned on people like Logan, believing that stepping onto the warehouse floor or showing concern for ordinary workers would make her look weak in front of the board. Mason told her that compassion never weakened a leader. Fear did, especially the kind of fear that convinced good people to hand their judgment over to someone else. Charlotte offered to resign, believing she should be held accountable for everything that had happened under her leadership. Mason neither accepted nor rejected the offer right away. Instead, he asked her one direct question. "Do you want to keep this position for your father's honor," he asked, "or for the people who still work every day under his name?" Charlotte admitted that until recently it had been the first reason. Starting today, she said, it would be the second. Mason gave her a conditional chance. Charlotte would personally lead the reforms, publicly accept responsibility, and submit to full oversight from the board throughout the process. This was also where something quieter began to take shape between them. Not sudden attraction, but a mutual respect between 2 adults who had each carried real loss and real responsibility for far too long. Charlotte noticed that Mason made no effort to reclaim the chief executive title for himself. Mason noticed that she had the courage to admit her mistakes in front of the entire board rather than hide behind excuses. Charlotte glanced at his old coat and asked whether he planned to change into something else before the press conference. Mason smiled faintly. "No," he said. "Today it has done far more good than every suit in this building combined." For the first time after a long and difficult day, Charlotte laughed. The independent investigation stretched across several weeks. Logan was charged with contract fraud, concealment of safety risks, and abuse of authority. Jessica was terminated and required to cooperate with investigators reviewing years of altered records. Mason did not order a sweeping purge of everyone who had once laughed at him. He insisted on reviewing each case individually, separating those who had acted out of genuine malice from those who had simply gone along out of fear for their own jobs. Charlotte publicly accepted responsibility in front of the entire workforce. Rather than placing all the blame on Logan, she admitted that the system itself had failed because leadership at the top had drifted too far from the people actually doing the work. The company introduced a direct reporting line connected to an independent safety committee, a hiring policy that concealed home address and financial background from reviewers, the authority for any worker to halt a production line upon spotting danger, a program to rehire employees who had been unfairly dismissed, a support fund for single parents working rotating shifts, and a public audit of every vendor contract across the organization. Owen, the candidate once rejected over a 3-minute delay, was invited back for a second interview and eventually became an operations coordinator. The older custodial worker kept her position along with the seniority benefits she had nearly lost. John, who had written the original warning letter, was reinstated, though his role in the story remained small and quiet, appearing only once to thank Mason for finally listening. Charlotte began spending regular days working directly inside the distribution centers instead of remaining behind closed doors on the top floor. She learned the names of forklift operators, listened to complaints she once would have delegated to someone else, and stopped scheduling her visits in advance so that what she saw would be real rather than staged for her benefit. Slowly, she began earning back the trust of employees who had grown used to being ignored. Mason declined to reclaim the chief executive title. He remained chairman only through the transition period, choosing to spend most of his time with his daughter instead. The connection between Mason and Charlotte deepened gradually through quiet conversations after work hours, shared coffee inside the warehouse break room, and a growing understanding of the responsibility they now shared toward the legacy their fathers had built. There was no rushed romance between them. Both understood that trust, much like an honest company, had to be built through small, repeated actions rather than a single grand gesture. Late one evening, Charlotte asked Mason whether the interview had secretly been a test meant for her as well. "No," he said. "It was a chance for you to see yourself clearly before you became the next Logan." Charlotte did not take offense. Instead, she thanked him for giving her the opportunity to change before it was too late. 6 months later, the Southern Chicago Distribution Center reopened after a complete renovation. Accident rates had dropped sharply, and productivity rose because workers no longer feared reporting problems the moment they appeared. Mason arrived at the ceremony in the same old pickup truck. He still wore a plain, simple coat, but this time no one looked at it with anything resembling contempt. Charlotte introduced Mason to the employees not as a billionaire or a chairman, but as the co-founder who had reminded everyone that the company exists to serve people, not the other way around. Mason kept his remarks short. "Do not respect someone simply because they have the power to dismiss you," he said. "Respect them because they are human beings, and build a place where that remains true even when the chairman is not standing in the room." Grace appeared briefly at the end of the ceremony, holding her father's hand. It was the only moment she was directly present in the entire story, with nothing dangerous or difficult asked of her. Charlotte greeted Grace warmly, then handed Mason an old name badge recovered from the archives, one that read Systems Engineer rather than Chairman. Mason said it had always been his favorite title, since it reminded him that almost any problem could be solved once someone was willing to look closely enough at its true cause. After the ceremony, Charlotte asked whether Mason would like to join her for dinner. She made it clear this had nothing to do with board business. Mason smiled and glanced toward Grace. His daughter gave a small, knowing nod before walking off with the babysitter who had already arrived to meet her. Mason agreed, adding that he still intended to wear the same old coat. "Good," Charlotte replied. "It reminds me that the most important interview of my life was the one I never even knew I was part of." The two of them walked out of the warehouse together beneath the fading Chicago light. There was no grand declaration of love, only the quiet beginning of something built on trust and mutual respect between two people who understood exactly what that cost. On the day Mason Reed walked into that company as a poor father asking for a chance, they laughed because they did not know who he was. The moment they learned his name, they rose to their feet. But the ones who truly deserved to stay were the ones who had already treated him with dignity, long before he ever needed a title to earn it. Mason Reed never needed a title to know his own worth, but it took a boardroom full of stunned faces for everyone else to finally see it. The old coat, the borrowed truck, the quiet patience through every insult, none of it was an accident. It was a test, one that revealed exactly who deserved to keep their seat at that table and who never truly belonged there at all. If this story reminded you that character reveals itself long before status ever does, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you believe kindness toward a stranger should never depend on what that stranger might turn out to be, stay close, because there is always another story worth telling.